I stared at my phone. One message. Who's picking me up? 3 dots appeared. Then stopped. Then came the answer. Call a taxi. I'm watching television. I dropped the phone. My IV beeped. The nurse rushed in. My stitches pulled. I smiled through the pain. That one sentence. It changed everything. 12 hours later, the same son was banging on my door. Too late. I'd made a decision. One no bedtime story could prepare them for. Because this story, it doesn't end with forgiveness. It ends with a camera crew, and a will, and silence. If you want to know what really happened, stay with me until the end. Before diving into this shocking mystery, God will bless you if you write Amen in the comments, and if you love thrilling, breathtaking stories. Don't forget to subscribe. The first thing I remember was the pain. It didn't creep in gently like a bad memory. It slammed into me like a freight train. My chest burned and ached, as though someone had taken a crowbar to it and pried it open. My eyes fluttered open to a harsh, white light that made my skull throb, and for a moment, I didn't know where I was. White walls, the steady beep of machines, tubes in my arms, plastic vines, cold and sterile. I tried to move, and my body screamed in protest. You're awake, a calm voice said beside me. I turned my head slowly. A woman in a white coat stood there with a kind expression behind wire-rimmed glasses. I'm Dr. Green, your cardiologist. How are you feeling? Mrs. Carpenter. I wanted to say I felt like I'd been trampled by a herd of cattle, but all that came out was a hoarse whisper. Hurts. She checked a monitor beside me, her face remaining calm. That's expected. You underwent emergency triple bypass surgery 2 days ago. Your heart stopped for 53 seconds during the procedure. 53 seconds. The words echoed in my skull like a hollow church bell. I was dead, technically dead, but we brought you back. She added softly, her fingers checking the pulse on my wrist. And you're going to be just fine. The surgery was successful. You'll need 2 weeks of recovery here, and then we'll slowly ease you back into daily activities. 2 weeks in this sterile place. I glanced around. One small window revealed a pale Oregon sky, heavy with winter clouds. There were no flowers, no cards, no soft scarves from my knitting group, no familiar faces, and worst of all, no Thomas. No Eric, not even a message scrawled on a sticky note. I closed my eyes for a moment, as if shutting out the world would change what I already knew in my gut. No one had come, not even once. Anurse kame in Nurse Rachel, her badge said. She was warm and gentle, adjusting my IV with practiced hands. You're doing great. Mrs. Carpenter, I'm here if you need anything. Thank you, I croaked, my throat still raw. She smiled and touched my hand lightly. Don't try to do too much. You've just been through a lot. When she left, the silence crept back in like a heavy fog. I reached weakly toward the nightstand, where someone had placed my things. My fingers brushed against my phone. I unlocked it. Dozens of notifications lit up the screen. News alerts, medication reminders, a coupon for a rug I didn't remember browsing. And then, I opened the family group chat. The last message was from over 3 weeks ago, Eric complaining that the internet was lagging again. Before that, Thomas had asked if anyone remembered to pick up the dry cleaning. Not a word about my surgery. Not a call. Not a how are you. Mom. I stared at the screen, my hand trembling slightly. The ache in my chest was no longer surgical. It was older, deeper, the kind of pain that came from being forgotten. My throat clenched with the weight of a realization I'd tried to avoid for years. I had spent decades pouring every ounce of my life into this family, packing lunches, sewing Halloween costumes, working late as a teacher just to help Eric get braces, making Thomas's favorite pot roast every Sunday. And when I almost died, it didn't even warrant a phone call. I set the phone down gently and stared at the ceiling tiles above my bed. They looked like the ones in the classroom I used to teach in, bright, sterile, practical. Back then, even the rowdiest third grader would rush to the front of the room when I came back from a dentist appointment. They noticed when I was gone. I closed my eyes, feeling a tear slide down the side of my face and into my hairline. I had been dead for 53 seconds, and apparently, nobody noticed. Not Thomas. Not Eric. Not even the dog I imagined had missed me. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like the click of a lock turning after years of being rusted shut. The days in the hospital passed slowly, the hours marked only by the beep of machines and the soft footsteps of nurses changing shifts. I had visitors, but not the kind that bring flowers or sit by your bed reading aloud. No, my visitors wore scrubs and gloves. Their kindness measured in vitals and medication dosages. Not once did my phone ring with a familiar voice asking, "How are you holding up, Mom?" Not once did I see Thomas's broad-shouldered figure walk through that door, pretending to be annoyed by hospital parking, but secretly relieved I was still breathing. Not once did Eric shuffle in with that sheepish grin, bringing me one of those bad lattes he liked to call treats. Just silence. And that old, familiarace. Not the surgical one, but the other kind. The kind that builds over years when you give too much and ask for too little. The nurses told me I was healing well. "Doctor," Green seemed pleased. "Your recovery's ahead of schedule," she said, smiling as if that would fill the hole inside me. But no one could answer the question I didn't dare speak aloud. If I had died on that table, would anyone have noticed? I found myself drifting back, memories flooding in, while the rain tapped softly against the window pane. It started, I think, in the summer of 2020. That was the first time I felt the tightness in my chest, like someone slowly wrapping a belt around my ribs and pulling. I'd been out in the garden, my hands deep in the soil around my peonies. The heat pressed down hard that day, but it wasn't the sun that made me stagger and grip the fence post. Thomas had called out from the back porch, "Don't overdo it. Helen, you're not 20 anymore." I laughed it off, like I always did, just weeding a little. "I'm fine," I'd said, wiping sweat from my brow. But I wasn't fine. By the fall of 2021, even climbing the stairs to our bedroom felt like scaling Mount Hood. I'd stop halfway up, pretending to inspect the framed photos on the landing just to catch my breath. My heart would pound so hard it echoed in my ears. Thomas never noticed. He'd be in bed already, snoring or flipping through the sports channels, while I stood alone in the hallway, steadying myself against the wall. "You're slowing down. 2 and 4, he'd mutter without looking at me. "Maybe cut back on the casseroles. Watch that cholesterol." He said it like a joke, but it stung. Not because he was wrong, but because it never once occurred to him to ask why I was so tired. And Eric, he was worse in his own way. Always in the basement, headphones on, eyes glued to a screen. Mom, the fees lagging again, was about as intimate as our conversations got. I tried. I truly did. I brought him meals, asked about job interviews he never attended, reminded him gently that 36 wasn't exactly figuring it out age anymore. "You worry too much," he'd mumble, eyes still locked on his monitor. "Relax. Mom, I got this." He never got it, and I stopped believing he would. I never told them about the dizzy spells, the metallic taste in my mouth when I stood up too fast, the way the world tilted like a carnival ride after just a short walk. I thought, what's the point? They'd just say it was stress or menopause, or maybe if they were feeling particularly insightful hormones. It wasn't hormones. It was my heart, slowly breaking. The first real scare came in March of 2023. I was making tea, Earl Grey, the way I liked it when the pain hit, sharp and sudden, a hammer to the chest. My knees buckled, and the teacup shattered on the linoleum as I slumped to the floor. "Thomas," I gasped. He was upstairs, watching the History Channel, oblivious. 10 minutes later, he came down and found me still on the floor, pale and shaking. "Did you fall?" he asked, eyes darting to the shards of porcelain. I don't know." He helped me to a chair, looked me over, and then glanced at the clock. "Well, I've got that dentist appointment. Can you call the clinic if it gets worse?" Call the clinic. I drove myself to the emergency room. The doctor was kind, young, careful with her words. She ran tests, asked questions I hadn't been asked in years. "You've had a minor heart attack," she said gently. "We'll need to do more tests, possibly surgery down the road." I remember sitting in the sterile waiting room, staring at a vending machine I couldn't afford to use because I'd forgotten my purse in the rush. No one came to get me. No one asked where I was. Later that night, when I told Thomas what the doctor had said, he frowned like I'd told him. The car needed repairs. "That sounds serious," he said, scrolling through his phone. "Do they have a payment plan?" I nodded. "They'll call me about the next steps." He didn't ask what those steps were. I told myself this was just how men were. That Thomas meant well in his own way. That Eric would come around. That families go through phases, but phases aren't supposed to last decades. By the time Dr. Green told me I needed the bypass, my world had already shrunk. My dreams of writing, of traveling, of maybe teaching part-time. Again, they were all sitting in a dusty drawer next to old recipes and unused passport forms. 6 months, if you don't do it, she'd said in November. 10 good years if you do. 10 good years. But with whom? I'd driven myself to the hospital the morning of the surgery. No one offered to come. Thomas had a long meeting, and Eric had a tournament online. They both wished me luck in the family group chat. And that was the last thing they said. Now, 2 weeks later, I lay in this sterile room, watching the sunlight fade across the beige wall. Nurse Rachel came in quietly, checking my vitals. She smiled, as always. "Warm, present. How are you holding up today?" "Helen." He hesitated. "I'm thinking," I whispered. She nodded knowingly. "Surgery gives you time to think. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes, not so much." After she left, I picked up my phone again. I stared at the group chat. Typed. "The doctor says I can go home today." Deleted. "Anyone available to pick me up?" Deleted. I tried one more time. Short. Simple. "Who's picking me up from the hospital?" I pressed send. Set the phone down. Waited. 5 minutes passed. Then it vibrated. "Eric, call a taxi. I'm watching something." Another message buzzed. "Thomas, stay another week. The house is peaceful." I stared at the screen. And then, for the first time, in a long while, I laughed. A sharp, bitter sound that surprised even me. 53 seconds. I was dead for 53 seconds. And not a soul missed me. The morning I was discharged from Riverbend Memorial Hospital was unusually bright for January. A soft mist hung just above the wet sidewalks outside my window, and the evergreens behind the parking lot sparkled with dew. Oregon winter had a way of making everything feel both clean and cold, like a fresh start with a warning. "Dr. Green smiled as she handed me my discharge papers. "You did remarkably well, Helen," she said, her voice gentle. "Just take it easy this month. No heavy lifting. No stress. If you can help it, stress. If only life worked that way." I packed my few belongings into the same navy blue weekend bag Thomas had given me on our 25th anniversary. It had held picnic lunches and board games once. Now it held a pair of flannel pajamas, and the paperback I never opened. Nurse Rachel helped me downstairs. "Will someone be picking you up?" He hesitated. "I'm calling a taxi." She gave me a long look but said nothing. She didn't need to. The taxi driver was a quiet woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a soft jazz station playing low on the radio. I gave her the address, and we drove in silence through familiar streets. Eugene looked the same, but I didn't. I held the discharge papers in my lap, creased and smudged at the edges. They were supposed to be instructions for recovery, what pills to take, what symptoms to watch for. But in my hands, they felt heavier, like evidence, like closure. When we pulled up in front of the house, I stared at it for a long moment. It was the same white clapboard home we'd lived in for over 40 years. The same green shutters. The same little wind chimes by the porch that I'd bought at a craft fair in 2096. It should have looked comforting. It didn't. The lawn was patchy, brown in places. My rose bushes hadn't been trimmed. There was a pile of Amazon boxes on the porch. The driveway was cluttered with Eric's car and a bike I didn't recognize. I paid the driver, thanked her, and slowly climbed the 3 steps to the front door. The key turned easily, but the door stuck a little, like it didn't recognize me. The house was quiet, but not empty. I could hear the low hum of a game console from the living room, The smell hit me first: stale pizza, something fried, and that unmistakable scent of gym socks that had long overstayed their welcome. The living room looked like a dorm room after finals week. Empty soda cans on the coffee table, fast food bags piled on my needlepoint ottoman. My recliner. My favorite reading spot was buried beneath a blanket, a hoodie, and a pair of gaming headphones. Eric was on the couch, feet propped up, headset on, yelling into a controller. Bro, flank left. No, left idiot. He didn't even look up when I walked in. I cleared my throat. Nothing. I spoke. Eric. He turned, startled. Oh, you're home? I set my bag down. Yes. Today was my discharge day. Oh, cool. He turned back to his game. Hope you're feeling better. That was it. I walked slowly to the kitchen. My knees ached, but I wasn't sure if it was from surgery or something older. The sink was full, not with dishes from a nice home-cooked meal, but with greasy paper plates and half-empty containers of ranch dressing. The trash was overflowing. Empty wine bottles lined the counter like trophies. I opened the fridge. 3 pints of premium ice cream, 2 expensive bottles of Chardonnay, and a box of frozen taquitos. No milk, no eggs, nothing I would have stocked. They hadn't been surviving without me. They'd been celebrating. I stood there, stunned, while the refrigerator hummed. And then I saw the worst of it: my study. The door was open. The small sanctuary I'd built for myself after retirement, where I wrote letters to former students, sorted old yearbooks, dreamed about someday starting my memoir. They had turned it into storage. Eric's broken monitors were stacked against the wall. Thomas's unopened mail was dumped across my writing desk. My knitting basket had been moved to the floor, and a pile of unfolded laundry sat on the armchair where I used to sit with my tea and classical music. It wasn't just neglect. It was erasure. I sat down hard on the edge of the desk, staring at a photograph still perched crookedly on the corner. The me in my classroom, surrounded by bright-eyed children holding construction paper flowers. I had mattered. Once, I had been someone, somewhere. I picked up my phone. 53 missed calls. All from Eric and Thomas. All from last night. All after the news aired. That's right. The news? Angela Barnes from the Northwest Heart Care Foundation had reached out after I filled out their online form last week. I hadn't planned to go public. Not at first. But something about the silence after my surgery, about the cruelty of those texts, had pushed me. Angela had said, "Helen, people need to hear this. You're not alone. And neither are they." She was right. I told my story, not to get even, not to humiliate, but because silence had nearly killed me once. I wasn't going to let it do it again. And now, the phones wouldn't stop ringing, but I didn't answer. Let them wonder. Let them squirm in their comfortable ignorance. I walked to the safe hidden behind the linen closet, hands steadier than I expected. The combination was my wedding date. I used to think that was romantic. Now it just felt ironic. Inside, my will was neatly folded, in its blue, legal envelope. I'd written it 2 years ago, after a mild scare and some gentle nudging from Thomas. It gave everything to him and Eric: the house, the savings, the pension, because of course it did. I carried it to the kitchen table and opened it under the yellow glow of the overhead light. To my beloved husband, Thomas Carpenter. Beloved. The word caught in my throat. To my son, Eric Carpenter. My hand hovered over the lines. No more. I pulled out my phone again. Searched. Estate Attorneys, Eugene, Oregon. There he was, David Connors, elder law specialist. I clicked schedule appointment. The house was quiet now. Eric had gone back to his game. Thomas wasn't home yet, probably at the diner, talking politics with men who thought women had it easy. I stood at the window, watching the last light disappear beyond the pines. Tonight, I would sleep under my own roof. Tomorrow, I would take my life back. The next morning, I woke early. Not from pain or the clatter of dishes, though I heard plenty of that downstairs, but from something deeper, a sense of direction, of clarity. It had been so long since I felt that. I dressed with quiet purpose, choosing a navy sweater and gray slacks. Nothing flashy, but enough to make me feel like someone who mattered again. Someone with a destination. When I stepped into the kitchen, Thomas looked up from the newspaper. Surprised. "You're dressed already?" he asked. "Going somewhere." I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. The chair creaked under my weight, an old sound. Oddly comforting. "Yes," I said. "I have an appointment in town." "With who?" "Just something I've been meaning to take care of." He shrugged and went back to reading. He didn't press. He never did not when it required effort. Eric was still in the basement. I could hear the faint thrum of his music through the vents. Not once had he come upstairs to check on me since I returned from the hospital. Not once had he asked how I'd been sleeping, or eating, or healing. So I slipped out without a word, locking the door behind me. David Connors's office was in an old brick building downtown, the kind with creaky wooden floors and antique ceiling fans. The plaque on his door read, "David Connors, SQ, Estate Planning, Elder Law, Trusts." I liked the weight of it. It felt final. The receptionist, a young woman named Elise, smiled warmly and offered me tea while I waited. The walls were lined with books, real books, leather-bound, with spines worn by time. It felt like a place where things were taken seriously. When David Connors emerged, he was younger than I expected, mid-50s perhaps, but with silver hair and kind eyes behind thin glasses. His handshake was firm, his tone gentle. "Mrs. Carpenter," he said, as he gestured to the chair across from his desk. "What can I help you with today?" I took out the blue folder from my bag and placed it on his desk. My hands didn't shake. "Not this time. I want to rewrite my will," I said. He opened it carefully, skimming the original. "To your husband and son," he murmured, more to himself than to me. Then he looked up. "And what would you like to change?" "I want to leave everything to the Northwest Heart Care Foundation," I said plainly. "House, savings, pension, everything." He blinked. "No provision for your husband or son." "No." He studied me a moment. "I need to ask, are you making this decision under duress? Or, I'm making this decision with perfect clarity," I said. "I had heart surgery 2 weeks ago. My heart stopped for 53 seconds. No one visited. No one called. When I texted to ask who would pick me up, my son told me to get a taxi. My husband told me to stay longer. It was peaceful without me." David's pen stilled over his legal pad. "I see," he said softly. "I've supported them both for 45 years. I continued. Cooked, cleaned, paid bills, worked 2 jobs during hard years. I postponed every dream I had so they could have theirs. I gave them everything, and when I almost died, they didn't notice." He nodded slowly. "Then it's your right to do this." We spent the next hour going over forms, reassigning beneficiaries, drafting new language. He suggested a charitable remainder trust, which would allow me to remain in the home for the rest of my life while allocating the remainder to the foundation after my passing. "And if you'd like," he said, "we can also arrange for a public announcement. The foundation works closely with media. Stories like yours have real impact." I thought of Nurse Rachel's words. Sometimes thinking is good, sometimes not so much. In this case, it felt like purpose, like healing in a different form. "Yes," I said, "let's do that." David handed the completed draft to Elise, who arranged for witnesses and a notary. 2 signatures, a stamp, a seal, just like that. 45 years of sacrifice, rewritten in clean black ink. As I left, he stood to shake my hand again. "Mrs. Carpenter, this is one of the clearest decisions I've ever seen, and one of the bravest." I didn't smile, but I nodded. "Not brave," I said, "just overdue." That afternoon, I met Angela Barnes at the downtown office of the Northwest Heart Care Foundation. She was younger than I expected, with short auburn hair and a voice that commanded attention. "I saw your email," she said as we shook hands, "and your story moved me. I think it could move a lot of people." Her office was filled with photos, cardiac survivors, a families reunited, children hugging grandparents, and there in the center, a framed newspaper article titled "Love in the Recovery Room, A Husband's 200 0-mile journey." Angela gestured toward a cozy sofa across from her desk. "If you're comfortable with it," she said, We'd like to record an interview. Just you, talking about what happened. We can pitch it to Channel 8, maybe a segment during Heart Health Week. What do you want me to say? The truth, she said simply. People respond to truth. It gives them permission to feel their own pain. I stared at the camera lens when the time came. It blinked red, waiting. And then I told them about the surgery, about the silence, about the texts. I gave everything I had to people who forgot I was even there. I said, my voice steady, so I decided to give what I had left to people who wouldn't. Angela didn't stop me. She didn't prod or push. She just listened. When we were done, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You're going to change lives. Helen, she whispered, not just with your gift, with your voice. By the time I returned home that evening, Thomas was pacing the living room. There you are, he said sharply. I've been calling. I was out. Where? With who? I had legal matters to attend to. He blinked. Legal. I didn't answer. I walked past him, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the table. Look, he said, voice softening. I know we weren't great about the surgery thing, but we were scared. Didn't know what to say. You said enough, I replied, pulling out a copy of the revised trust. You said it was peaceful without me. His face fell. I didn't wait for a reply. The truth didn't need one. It aired on a Wednesday night. Channel 8's evening segment. Angela had warned me. It would feel surreal, that watching myself on television would be like meeting a stranger who knew all my secrets. She wasn't wrong. I sat alone in my living room, the cup of chamomile tea in hand, the television flickering softly against the walls I'd cleaned and cared for since 1981. The house was quiet. Thomas had gone out, claiming a men's group meeting. Eric, I assumed, was in the basement, glued to his screen. The segment began with sweeping shots of the Oregon landscape, fog-laced forests, hospital corridors, nurses bustling between rooms. Then came the words, tonight, an extraordinary story from Eugene, one woman's gift, and the silence that inspired it. And there I was, sitting in Angela's softly lit office, wearing the navy sweater I'd chosen deliberately, eyes tired but clear. I spoke simply, without flourish, about the surgery, the heart that stopped, the son who said, call a taxi, the husband who texted, stay another week, it's peaceful. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just told the truth. I gave them my best years, I said into the lens, and when I nearly died, they chose not to notice. The segment cut to photos of our house, images of me in my classroom, newspaper clippings from school fundraisers I'd helped lead. Then came Angela, explaining the trust, the donation, the foundation's mission. She could have chosen bitterness, Angela said. Instead, she chose to build something from the wreckage. The final shot was of me walking down the steps of the courthouse, sunlight hitting my face. The voiceover said, a legacy not built on inheritance, but on intention. And then the credits rolled. I sat there for a long while after the screen faded to black. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just still. Until the first call came in. Eric. I let it ring. Then Thomas. Then Eric again. Then again. Within 20 minutes. I had 32 missed calls and 14 text messages. A few angry. A few pleading. Most of them confused. As if they couldn't quite believe what they'd seen. As if the story of their abandonment had somehow happened to someone else. At message number 51, I turned the phone off and went to bed. Across town, the reaction was different. Thomas had walked into the kitchen with his coat still on, flipping through the mail, when Eric's voice called out from the living room, Dad, come here. Thomas grumbled something, but followed the sound. There, on the screen, was their house. Then Helen's face. They stared. As she began to speak, the silence in the room thickened. Thomas sat down slowly. Eric's mouth fell open. She didn't, he whispered. She couldn't have, but she had. Every word landed like a blow. Call a taxi. Stay another week. It was peaceful. Thomas stood up halfway through, pacing. She's exaggerating. This is being taken out of context. But there was no denying it. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't edited. It was calm, clear. Devastating. By the end of the segment, Eric was pale. She changed the will, he asked. I don't know, Thomas said. She gave everything to a heart foundation. Thomas didn't answer. The room was quiet. Then Eric exploded. This is insane. We need to stop this. Call her. Call the lawyer. He did both. Over and over. Neither answered. They stayed up all night, pacing, whispering, searching the internet for the foundation's name, trying to understand how 45 years of comfort could evaporate in a single news segment. But deep down, they knew. This didn't happen overnight. This had been coming. The next morning, I turned my phone back on. 73 missed calls, 23 voicemails, dozens of texts. Eric's messages ranged from defensive to desperate. Mom, you made us look like monsters. That was private. Please call me. Please. I'm sorry. Thomas's were shorter. We need to talk. You've made your point. This is our life you're blowing up. I made myself a quiet breakfast. Poached eggs, rye toast, a small bowl of blueberries. I ate in silence, my phone face down. Then I got dressed and headed back to Angela's office. She met me in the lobby, practically glowing. Your story is taking off, she said. The phones haven't stopped ringing. Viewers are asking how to donate, how to volunteer, how to talk to their own parents. She paused. Some are even saying they see themselves in your son, that they've taken someone for granted. You've started a conversation. I smiled faintly. Good. Let it be useful. Then, she pulled me into a conference room. We've had 3 local papers reach out. One wants an interview. 2 others want to reprint the story. And the foundation board wants to meet you. Formally. Maybe do a small gala dinner in your honor this spring. I sat down slowly, still adjusting to the idea of being seen again. You don't have to do any of it, Angela said. But if you want to, the door is wide open. I thought of the years I'd spent invisible, the classroom I left behind, the garden I tended alone, the meals that went unthanked. Then I looked up and said, I think I'd like to meet the board. It didn't take long for them to show up. By Friday morning, less than 48 hours after the segment aired, I spotted Thomas's car crawling down our street like a stray dog looking for a meal. He parked, sat behind the wheel for a moment, then stepped out with the stiff gait of a man who suddenly realized he might have to work for what he used to be handed. He rang the doorbell twice, knocked once, then called my name through the screen door. Helen, it's me. I stood just beyond the entryway, holding a cup of tea, heart steady. After a long pause, I opened the door. He looked tired, not like a grieving husband, more like someone trying to act wounded because they'd been caught. You're home, he said. I live here, I replied. He hesitated. May I come in? I stepped aside without a word. He entered cautiously, glancing around as if the house had changed in his absence. It hadn't, only I had. He sat down at the kitchen table like he always did, but his posture was smaller now, like someone who knew the authority he used to wield had quietly expired. I watched the segment, he began. We both did. I nodded and sat across from him. He sighed. I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. I did. He stared at his hands. You made us look heartless. You didn't need my help for that. Thomas. His head shot up. For once, I didn't look away. I know we didn't handle your surgery well, he said. We should have done more. Should have shown up. I'll admit that. I waited. But this, going public, giving away everything, it's extreme. Helen, is it? He paused. You've embarrassed us. No, I said. I told the truth. And the truth embarrassed you. Silence filled the room like fog. I gave you my life. Thomas, I continued, voice calm. I gave up travel, hobbies, friendships. I worked extra hours so Eric could have braces. I packed your lunch every day, even when you never said thank you. And when I was dying, you were watching a rerun of a war documentary. You texted me to stay longer because it was peaceful. He flinched. I was joking. I wasn't. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw it. The realization that something was gone, something he thought would always be there. I stood, You have 24 hours to find somewhere else to stay. I said, "What? This is my house now. Not ours. Mine. The deed is in my name. The trust is filed. The foundation owns it after I pass. You have until tomorrow to pack what you need." His mouth opened, closed. "You're serious." As a heart attack, he stood, pacing. "You can't just throw away 45 years. I'm not. I'm just done pretending they were worth more than they were." He stared at me like I'd become someone he didn't recognize. And maybe I had. Eric arrived that evening. He didn't knock. Just walked in like he always had, still in his hoodie, though this time it looked older, worn. "Mom," he said, breathless. "What's going on?" I was folding laundry in the den. "I saw your messages," I said. "All 73 of them." I was worried. "No, you were scared. There's a difference." He swallowed hard. "I didn't mean what I texted. About the taxi. I was in the middle of something. I didn't realize how serious it was." "You didn't ask." His shoulders slumped. "I didn't know how. After 36 years. Eric, you should have learned." He sat on the edge of the armrest like he used to when he was a boy. "Are you really giving everything away?" "Yes. To strangers. To people who value life. But we're family." "Family," I repeated softly. "You lived in my house rent-free. Used my electricity. Ate the food I bought. I slept in sheets. I washed. You called that love. I called it unpaid labor." He didn't respond. "You have 24 hours, I said. "Same as your father." "Where am I supposed to go?" "You're 36. Start there." He stood slowly. "This isn't you." "No," I said. "This is the me you never met because you were too busy taking." His voice cracked. "Please don't do this." I already did. And with that, I turned off the light and left him standing in the dark. By Saturday evening, the house was a flurry of cardboard boxes and passive-aggressive sighs. Thomas packed slowly, mumbling about betrayal and public humiliation. Eric sulked, stuffing his electronics into garbage bags like it was some kind of protest. I didn't help. I didn't hover. I simply sat on the porch with a book, sipping tea, watching the sun dip behind the Douglas firs. The neighbors peeked from their windows. I didn't mind. Let them see. By 6:00 p.m. sharp, they were gone. No hugs, no goodbyes, just silence. And for the first time in years, that silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. They left at sunset. 2 cars loaded to the brim, one dusty blue sedan and a sputtering old hatchback, taillights disappearing down the quiet neighborhood street. No horns, no waves, no last-minute apologies. Just exhaust fumes and the sudden, miraculous sound of stillness. I stood in the doorway, barefoot on the warm porch wood, and watched them go. A part of me expected my hands to tremble, my knees to buckle, the grief to flood in like high tide. But none of that happened. Instead, I felt light. Not happy, not yet, but free. I closed the door behind me and walked through the house slowly. It looked different. It was different. No more wrappers on the coffee table. No more blaring television from the basement. No more muddy shoes by the door or unanswered calls for help in the kitchen. Just me, the house I'd cleaned for decades, and the rooms I'd memorized blindfolded. Suddenly, they belonged to me again. Not just in name, in presence, in permission. That night, I lit a lavender candle, opened the windows to let in the cool Oregon air, and took a long bath. A real bath, not the rushed, guilty kind. Squeezed in before someone needed something. Afterward, I curled up in bed with a book, Willa Cather, of all things, and read until I fell asleep, with the light still on. It was the best night's sleep I'd had in 10 years. February passed, slowly, gently. Each morning, I made breakfast just for myself. I tried recipes I hadn't cooked in years. Poached pears, sourdough waffles, lemon tea with honey and ginger. I reorganized my study. The laundry piles were gone. The desk was clear. I found my old teaching journals, yellowed but still rich, with stories, notes from children long grown, doodles in the margins that made me laugh out loud. I started writing again, not for anyone else, Just for me. Little stories, memories, reflections. There was peace in being unneeded, but also a strange hunger. One morning, while sweeping the back porch, I paused and looked at the dusty stack of travel brochures I'd kept hidden in my sewing cabinet for years. Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, the Blue Ridge Mountains, national parks I'd dreamed of but never dared plan for. Not until now. So I booked a trip. Just one. A modest start. Big Bend National Park, Texas. March. It felt wild, irresponsible, glorious. I bought a secondhand suitcase, packed hiking boots I'd never used, and downloaded trail maps onto my phone like a woman preparing for the moon. I told no one. I owed no one. And when March arrived, I boarded a plane for the first time in 12 years. Big Bend was breathtaking. Wide open skis, mountains that rose like ancient guardians, canyons that made my chest ache not from surgery, but from wonder. I stayed in a simple cabin, no television, no Wi-Fi, just silence and stars. On my second evening, I joined a group campfire, hosted by the park rangers. That's where I met Joanne Mitchell, 72, sharp as a tack, and already on her third solo road trip since retirement. Lost my husband 5 years ago, she said, pouring us both mugs of cocoa. Took me a year to remember who I was before I became Mrs. Mitchell. Turns out, I'm someone pretty interesting. We laughed. We talked. We hiked together the next morning. She taught me how to use trekking poles. I taught her how to brew tea on a camp stove. We promised to keep in touch, and we did. That trip changed me. Not all at once. Not like in the movies. But something opened inside me, a door I'd long boarded shut. I started moving through the world as someone whole, not someone waiting to be needed. And for the first time, the world noticed me back. April came. I went to Colorado. Joanne joined me. We hiked short trails, photographed wildflowers, and stayed in little inns with creaky floors and handmade quilts. At a local photography exhibit, I met Charlotte Lee, a widow in her 60s, who ran nature photography workshops for beginners. I see something in you, she said, reviewing the photos I'd taken on my phone, a quiet kind of composition. You see things other people overlook. We exchanged numbers. She invited me to join a photography hike that summer in Utah, back home in Eugene. I printed my favorite photo, a sunrise over the mountains in Colorado, and framed it above my desk. That same week, Angela from the foundation called. The board loved your story, she said. Would you consider being part of a campaign this fall? Maybe speak at one of our awareness events. He hesitated. I'm not a speaker, I said. You're a survivor, she replied. And that's more powerful. So I agreed. I began writing the speech that night. The title came easily. What I learned when my heart stopped. By summer, my name had become something I never imagined. Familiar. Not famous. Not in any celebrity sense. But known, respected. Strangers stopped me at the market. You're the woman from the news, one said, gripping my hand with both of hers. The one who stood up for herself. You changed how I talked to my mother. In the coffee shop near the library, the barista handed me my tea with a quiet, "My dad cried when he watched your story." He called his sister for the first time in years. Emails poured in, some from faraway states, others from right here in Eugene. One woman wrote, I've been married for 40 years, and your story gave me the courage to say, enough, M. A man, recently widowed, shared, I never thanked my wife enough. I'm starting now with my daughter. Each message humbled me, not because I'd intended to inspire anyone, but because speaking the truth, even just once, had echoed farther than I'd ever thrown any stone. Angela was right. The story wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition, and it was just beginning. The Heart Foundation invited me to speak at their Autumn Renewal Gala, a gathering of survivors, donors, medical professionals, and families. The event was held in Portland, at a modest but elegant community center near the river, fairy lights strung along the ceiling beams, tables lined with candles and photos of heart patients before and after their recovery. Angela greeted me with a hug. You clean up beautifully, she said with a wink. I was wearing a burgundy dress I hadn't touched since Eric's college graduation. It fit differently now. Not looser. Not tighter. Just better. I stood backstage, heart racing, but not from nerves. From purpose. When they called my name, the applause startled me. And then I began. 256 days ago, my heart stopped beating for 53 seconds. When I woke up, no one was there. That moment, empty and quiet, became the loudest truth of my life. I told them everything. Not just the facts, but the feelings, the years of invisibility, the crushing weight of being needed without being valued, the joyless routine disguised as duty, the silence that followed the surgery, the insult that followed my plea. I ended with what mattered most. I thought I was too old to start over. But the truth is, there is no expiration date on self-respect, no age limit on peace, no statute of limitations on joy. The crowd rose. I didn't expect it. I didn't look for it. But I stood there, surrounded by the sound of people who saw me not as a victim or a symbol, but as someone who had finally chosen herself. That speech was posted online. And once again, the messages came. From women in their 70s, from men who'd retired and felt forgotten, from adult children reckoning with how they'd treated their parents. One message stood out. A woman named Eloise, from Minnesota, wrote, "I'm about to go into heart surgery myself. I'm scared, alone, but I watched your speech, and now I feel brave. You reminded me that my life matters, even if no one's told me that in a long time." Angela invited me to visit the Foundation's patient center. I began volunteering twice a week, speaking to new cardiac patients, especially the ones with few or no visitors. I didn't offer advice. I offered presence. Sometimes that was enough. Was it hard? They'd ask. Yes, I always said. But it was harder to stay invisible. I'd sit beside them, hold a hand if they wanted, listen to their fears. Some of them cried. Others just nodded. All of them. I hoped. I felt a little less alone. In September, I received an envelope in the mail. Thick, cream-colored. No return address. Inside was a photo. Eric, standing in front of a small office building in downtown Eugene, dressed in slacks and a button-up shirt. Smiling. Tired, but standing tall. A sticky note attached read, "Day 90 of work. Still showing up. Just wanted you to know. No apology. No plea. Just a moment of growth." Sent silently. I placed the photo on my study shelf, not in forgiveness, in acknowledgement that people can change, that maybe one day the soil would be rich enough to plant something new, but only if watered by effort. October brought colors I hadn't noticed in years, the kind that glowed not just in the trees, but in my skin, in my voice. Charlotte invited me to Utah for a weekend photography retreat. Joanne joined, too. The three of us, three widows with walking sticks and camera bags, hiking red rock trails under gold-splashed skies. We woke early, chased light across canyons, brewed coffee on portable stoves, and laughed like girls at sleepaway camp. At night, we sat under stars, trading stories not of husbands, not of children, but of ourselves. I never liked knitting, Joanne admitted. I only did it because my mother did. I hate gardening, Charlotte said. I just liked the peace it gave me. I laughed. I loved teaching, but I think I'm ready to be the student now. And I was, of landscapes, of stories, of life, unmeasured by how useful I could be to someone else. By the time October turned to November, I had seen more sunrises in 6 months than I had in the previous 10 years combined. I returned to Eugene quietly, as I always did now, not because I was hiding, but because I no longer needed anyone's permission to come and go. The house welcomed me like an old friend. Clean. Still. The kind of quiet that listens instead of smothering. I unpacked slowly, savoring the stillness. My photography gear. My journals. A new scarf Charlotte had knit for me on our last trip. And tucked among it all, the printed photos from Utah. Sandstone arches glowing gold. Joanne squinting into the wind. Me grinning with my arms wide in front of a canyon. I pinned one to the corkboard above my desk. My desk. Still mine. No dust. No clutter. No compromise. That evening, I made a simple stew and set one place at the table. Lit a candle. Opened a novel. ate slowly, savoring not the food, but the fact that I didn't have to explain my choices to anyone. The next morning, I visited my favorite cafe downtown Cedar, Sage. It was a small place, tucked between a florist and a bookstore. They served their tea in proper ceramic mugs, not paper cups. I ordered my usual chamomile with honey and took a seat by the window. 5 minutes later, the door opened, and Eric walked in. He didn't see me at first. He looked different, less boyish, more tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind earned by showing up every day. He stepped up to the counter and ordered black coffee. No extras, no sugar, just coffee. I watched quietly. He turned to scan the room, and his eyes landed on me. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then, he walked over slowly. "Mom," he said softly. I nodded. "Eric, may I sit?" I gestured to the empty chair. He sat carefully, like a guest. Unsure of his welcome, we were silent for a moment. The clink of spoons and hum of quiet conversations filling the gap. "You look well," he said. "So do you." He glanced down. I saw the newsletter from the foundation, the one with your speech transcript. I waited. I read the whole thing. He continued. "Twice. Still." I said nothing. I didn't call because, well, I didn't know what I could say that would mean anything. Words feel cheap now. That's because they are. I said, "Until they're backed by action." He nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photo, folded once, handed it to me. It was a snapshot of his apartment, tiny, tidy. A futon, a bookshelf, a kitchen counter with a bowl of fruit. "I've been there 5 months now," he said, "still working at the agency. It's not glamorous, but I pay for it." I studied the image, not with judgment, just curiosity. "I cook for myself now," he added. "Laundry too." I looked up. "That's a start." He smiled faintly. "I'm not here to ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not money, not even time. I just wanted to show you. I heard you, that I changed something." I leaned back, letting his words settle. "I believe people can change," I said, "but not everyone wants to." "I didn't want to," he admitted. "Not until I lost the version of you who would have let me keep taking." I looked at him, really looked. He was still my son. Still the boy who once cried over scraped knees and used to leave me crayon notes on the fridge. But he was also something else now, someone trying. "I don't know if we can ever go back," I said. "I'm not asking to." "Then what are you asking for?" He paused. "Coffee. Once a month. Maybe more. Maybe less. Just time. No expectations." "That I could consider." "Coffee," I echoed. "That I can do." His smile was cautious, grateful, real. We sat for a while longer, zipping in silence. And the weight of years between us finally beginning to lift, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer pressing down. When we stood to leave, he held the door open for me. "See you next month?" he asked. I nodded. "Next month." And then we went our separate ways, but not as strangers anymore. The days settled into a rhythm that felt honest. Mornings began with sunlight filtering through linen curtains and the soft groan of the kettle on the stove. I no longer rushed to make breakfast for someone else. I made what I wanted: soft-boiled eggs one day, yogurt, with berries the next. Sometimes I skipped breakfast entirely and sat by the window with a book, watching the squirrels play in the fir trees behind the house. Eric and I met once a month, just like he asked, always at Cedar and Sage, always the same booth near the window. We didn't talk about the past, not directly, but sometimes, in between stories about his work or the soup I'd tried to cook from scratch, there were pauses, weighted silences, small, fragile spaces where 1,000 unsaid things sat like ghosts at the table. And yet, something was growing. Not a mother-son relationship in the old sense. That one was buried. This was new, slow, earned. He showed me photos of designs he'd worked on, logos, websites, a small brochure for a local charity. "They liked it," he said once, shyly, said it felt human. "That's because you are," I replied. "You just had to remember." Sometimes he'd ask about my next trip. Sometimes I'd show him the photos. One day, he brought me a gift. A camera strap, leather, hand-stitched. I thought yours looked worn out, he said, not meeting my eyes. It was the first thing he'd given me in years that didn't require batteries or apology. I accepted it without a word. But that evening, I cried in the bath. Not from pain, from proof. In early November, I received an invitation from Joanne and Charlotte. 3-week road trip. The message read, Montana to Arizona. One last big adventure before winter. I hesitated. There was snow in the forecast. My knee still ached some days. The idea of being that far from home felt heavier than before. But then I remembered something Nurse Rachel once said, back in the hospital. You don't come back from death the same way. You get to choose who you are now. So I said yes. We met in Helena, Montana, bundled in scarves and gloves, giggling like teenagers, trying to remember how GPS worked. We drove south in Charlotte's old but reliable Subaru, the trunk packed with tea, hiking boots, memory foam pillows, and more snacks than 3 women could possibly eat. We hiked Kiat valleys. We slept in cabins that smelled of pine and fireplace smoke. We took pictures of elk at sunrise and shared our favorite love songs over tinny speakers. One night in Utah, we stayed at a desert inn with thick adobe walls and endless stars. We sat outside with mugs of cocoa, blankets around our legs. Joanne looked at me over the rim of her cup. You're lighter now? She said. I'm freer, I replied. Charlotte smiled. Do you miss them? Your old life? I considered the question. No, I said, but I grieve for the woman who lived it. We sat in silence after that. Not sadness, just reverence. When I returned to Eugene before Thanksgiving, I didn't feel the usual post-trip letdown. Instead, I felt grounded. I spent the week decorating the house with small touches. A garland of dried oranges over the fireplace, a ceramic bowl filled with pine cones by the entry, a wreath on the door made from cedar branches and dried lavender. I lit candles every evening. Not for anyone else, just for me. Eric texted one morning, I'm cooking this year, not just ordering takeout. Do you want to come by for dinner? I stared at the message. Years ago, I might have answered immediately, might have planned a side dish, offered to clean up, prepped a dessert from scratch. Now, I let it sit for an hour. Then I replied, yes. As a guest, he sent back a thumbs up, and the word, understood. Thanksgiving was simple. A folding table, 3 chairs, Eric, me, and his co-worker, a woman named Marisol, who was warm and kind and told terrible puns. We ate turkey. He had roasted himself slightly dry but full of heart. I brought spiced pears. No one talked politics. No one brought up the news segment. No one mentioned the years between us. It wasn't a family gathering. It was a gathering of people learning to be human with each other again. After dessert, Eric walked me to my car. The night was crisp. Leaves crunched under our feet. I know I don't deserve second chances, he said, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. No one deserves them, I said. That's what makes them gifts. He looked at me. Uncertain, but you have to keep earning them, I added. I will, he said. I hope so, I said. We didn't hug. That was still too soon. But when I drove away, I saw him in the rearview mirror, still standing in the street, still watching. And for the first time, I let that mean something. Winter came gently that year. The kind of Oregon winter where the rain hums like a lullaby and the wind sounds more like whispers than warnings. I found it comforting, like the earth was giving me space to breathe. I decorated the house with small things, nothing extravagant. A few snowflake-shaped lights along the porch, candles in the windows, a knitted blanket I'd found in a thrift shop, now draped over the arm of my favorite chair. For the first time in decades, I wasn't preparing for visitors. I wasn't checking grocery lists twice or stressing over matching napkins. There were no passive-aggressive texts from Susan asking who was bringing what. No Eric making excuses about coming late or leaving early. No stomachache of obligation. Just me, my little home, and the soft thud of raindrops against the roof. And yet, I didn't feel alone. One Tuesday morning, I drove into town to visit the used bookstore. It had become a habit of mine like church. But quiete, no sermons, just stories. I was flipping through a memoir about a woman who'd hiked the Appalachian Trail alone when someone spoke behind me. Careful, that one'll make you want to buy boots and run away. I turned. A man, maybe early 70s, with silver hair, dark eyes, and a wool coat that had clearly seen better winters. He smiled, not the flirty kind, not the patronizing kind, the kind of smile someone gives when they recognize another survivor. I read that one last fall, he continued, tapping the book's spine. Ended up walking 15 miles before I realized I'd forgotten my arthritis meds. I laughed. That's a painful kind of inspiration. I'm Frank, he said, offering a hand. Frank Lindstrom, Helen Carpenter. His grip was warm, firm. I liked that he didn't follow it up with any awkward jokes or too personal questions. Do you hike? He asked, genuinely curious. Now and then. Mostly I take pictures of trees and pretend I'm braver than I am. That counts. We talked a few minutes longer about books, the best rainproof jackets, how he'd once gotten lost near Mount Hood and ended up at a campground wedding. They thought I was the officiant. I married a couple I'd never met. Before we parted, he handed me a small business card. Not selling anything, he said. Just, if you ever want to talk photography or take a rainy walk where someone else knows the trail. The card had his name, number, and a small photo of a mountain vista. I didn't call him right away, but I didn't throw the card away either. Christmas Eve came and went without a single pang. No tree, just pine branches in a glass vase on the mantel. I made hot cocoa, curled up under my thrift store blanket, and watched an old black and white movie about second chances. The next morning, I texted Eric, "Merry Christmas. Wishing you peace, not presents." He replied an hour later, "Best gift I've gotten all year. Merry Christmas. Mom. Mom." It was the first time he'd called me that in a year. I stared at the word until my cocoa went cold. Then I poured myself a new cup and stepped out onto the porch, letting the winter air hit my face like a baptism. This year, I wasn't mourning who I used to be. This year, I was becoming someone new. In January, Frank called, said he'd be walking the Riverside Trail if I wanted to join. Low incline, good light this time of day. I almost said no. My knee had been stiff all week. I had a half-finished puzzle on the dining room table. But something in his voice reminded me of the warmth I'd missed for too long. Not romantic, not possessive, just companionship. So I said yes. We walked for over an hour, stopping every 10 minutes to snap photos of mossy logs and ducks with too much personality. Frank carried an old Nikon, said digital was fine, but film taught patience. You don't take 10 shots and pick the best. You wait. You frame. You breathe. I liked that. He didn't ask about my past, and I didn't offer it. But when we sat on a bench overlooking the water, watching the fog drift like smoke, I said, almost without meaning to, "I died last year, for 37 seconds." He didn't flinch. "Then you've seen both sides," he said. I saw who I'd been giving my life to, and who hadn't noticed. I was gone. Frank didn't respond right away, but he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a peppermint. "Here," he said, placing it in my palm. "The only thing I know how to offer when words aren't enough." I smiled. "It's enough." And it was. February came with more rain, more walks, and more conversations that didn't rush or demand or dig too deep. Frank and I never called what we were anything. We didn't go to restaurants or send flowers or update our relationship status. But we kept showing up, twice a week, sometimes 3, always with cameras, always with laughter. One day, he surprised me, brought a photo. He'd taken a black and white shot of me standing under a leafless tree, looking skyward. "You looked like someone who remembered how to pray," he said. I stared at it, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "You're allowed to be seen," he added. That night, I put the photo on my mantel, right beside a framed picture of myself from my 20s back when I thought sacrifice was love and silence was strength. I looked at both photos for a long time, the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. One believed love was endurance. The other had learned that love, real love, begins with choosing yourself, and that maybe, just maybe, choosing yourself didn't have to mean choosing loneliness. Spring arrived, as it always does, quiet and unassuming, turning branches to green and waking bulbs from their winter slumber. But this spring felt like mine, not because everything had changed, but because I decided to plant a garden. Not tomatoes, not roses. Those were too tied to old routines, to seasons of trying and begging for appreciation. Instead, I planted lilacs, leonor, and wildflowers I found in little packets labeled pollinator mix, a promise to bees and butterflies and something new inside me. Each morning, I'd step into the soft earth and water the seedlings, humming old lullabies I used to sing as a teacher. They grew, slowly, sturdily. So did I. One evening, in April, Frank knocked on my door with 2 cups of chamomile. I figured we could give those lilacs a head start with a soak, he said, eyes crinkling in that kind way that said he was happy to help and was glad it mattered to me. We sat among the flowers, on the warmed stones of the patio, the air scented with earth and possibility. You've nourished things in your life before, he said, gentle, kind. You were always so giving. I looked at the blooms. I was giving to things that didn't recognize it. He hesitated. But now, I continued, softer. I'm giving to things that do. He nodded. Those flowers, he said. Later. They're like you. Quiet strength. Color when least expected. My throat caught. That's a good thing. I managed. In May, I attended my first photography exhibit, Aging Gracefully Through the Lens, where my photos, alongside Charlotte's and Joanne's, were displayed. Crowds drifted in and out, retirees pointing out the lines of my hand in the portraits, other walkers lingering by the shots of desert horizons and snow-dusted forests. I stood near my photo of the tree, remembering what Frank said, and heard someone murmur, "That woman. She looked like she found herself." I thought of the lilacs outside, and of the blooming inside me, and later, when someone introduced themselves as a woman in her late 60s who'd also undergone heart surgery alone, and said my story gave her permission to stop waiting to be noticed. I held her hand and whispered, "You deserve to be seen. Always." Summer began with full petals and slow afternoons. I spent mornings weeding, afternoons reading by the window, and evenings walking with Frank through the neighborhood. We didn't define us. Maybe we never would, but the silences were full. Now, terribly alive. One day, as we walked, he stopped and picked a wildflower. "It seems wrong to pick things that are meant to grow," he said. I smiled. "Since when were you concerned about botany ethics?" He paused. "Since I saw what beauty that dependence can kill." I wrapped my hand around the flower stem. "Maybe we're different because we learned to bloom alone," I said. He didn't respond. We just walked. In the fall, I received a handwritten letter from Eric. No demands. No expectations. Just words. "Mom, I didn't ask this before, but if you ever need company on a weekend drive or a walk by the river, I'd like to be the one you invite." I looked out the window at the lilacs, now tall and fragrant, shaking in the breeze. I wrote back, "I'd like that." He replied 3 days later, "What day works for you?" I replied, "How about Saturday, 10 o'clock? Your treat." That Saturday came with crisp air and the first hint of golden leaves. Eric showed up at my door with coffee and sandwiches from the cafe, and the first real smile I'd seen in months. We walked through the park, side by side, not mother and son, just 2 people finding their way. We talked about simple things, work, books, weather, and when he asked about the garden, I told him it felt more alive than I ever did. He nodded. "Because you are alive," he said, in a way I didn't let see for too long. I reached for his arm, gently. That was all we needed. Winter approached again, and with it came quiet evenings, spent reading by the fire. I wrote a short essay for the Heart Foundation's newsletter, a reflection on how love begins when you give yourself permission to bloom. However late, on the night it was published, I received messages from strangers and friends alike. Joanne and Charlotte sent handwritten letters. Frank left a folded photo of our wildflower garden. the lilacs in full bloom. And Eric, he called. Once, 2 weeks ago, he didn't have to say much. Just a soft good night. I said good night back. There are endings in life, but there are also beginnings. Some of them arrive as gardens that quietly bloom. Others come as friendships that become safe harbors. Some arrive in borrowed silence and coffee on porches. I learned this year that our hearts, even the ones that almost stopped, have space to give. To new people, to new moments, to being alive. Winter will come again, as it always does, but so will spring. And with it, a chance to bloom again. Spring had settled in fully. The lilacs I'd planted the previous year bloomed proudly, nodding their lavender heads in the soft morning breeze. Their fragrance was gentle, expectant, but steadfast, like the life I had chosen to build for myself. I woke one morning to a voicemail from the Heart Foundation. Mrs. Carpenter, your essay hasn't left us. A group of high school students on a community service trip would love to meet you and hear your story in person. Is that something you'd consider? I paused. Public speaking wasn't foreign, but this felt different, more intimate, more earnest. But then I remembered something, the bookstore encounter, Frank's kindness, the way my photographs made strangers feel seen, and most of all, the power of words spoken from the heart. So, I said yes. On a Tuesday morning, bright, with possibility, I walked into the local community center. Teenagers milled about, awkwardly characterful, faces open yet unsure. I spoke about my heart surgery, about being nearly invisible in my own family, about choosing boundaries, about planting flowers that didn't need me to prove anything. I told them, your worth isn't measured by what others expect of you. Let your life bloom, even if only for you. One girl with shy eyes asked, but what if people push back? What if they get mad when we say no? I paused, let the information sink in. I replied, simply, love doesn't demand that you give everything. Love sets boundaries. That's how it becomes honest, and how you respect yourself. Their nods felt like seeds planted. Afterward, a young teacher named Mia approached me. I come from a family where boundaries were unheard of. Your story gave me the courage to ask for them. You changed how I plan to parent my kids. We stood together, lilac petals drifting through the open window behind us. I realized then that my life hadn't just begun anew, it had become fertile ground. At home, I found a package by the door, a box of lilac-scented candles, and a note from Charlotte. These smell like your garden, calm and alive. Keep blooming. And another envelope from Joanne. Tickets to a photography exhibit in Portland's Botanical Garden. Let's go see bloomers of different kinds. My heart squeezed with gratitude, with connection, with the unexpected sweetness of new friendships. That evening, I met Eric at Cedar and Sage again, our now familiar booth by the window. He seemed younger, freer. I've been thinking, he began, about love, about how it wasn't about what I deserved but what I could earn. With respect, he looked at me, his voice steady. I want to be someone who notices people when they're gone. My throat clenched, but I smiled softly. You already are, I replied. You just needed space to remember. He reached across the table. I let him. No grand declarations, no expectations, only presence. Spring turned to summer, and I continued planting not just flowers, but community. A walking group started gathering on Sundays behind the community center. Older folks, younger folks, all of us sharing the trail under dappled light. We carried cameras, coffee cups, stories. Frank joined, as did Mia, and a few of those students. We walked quietly, but the silence between us was alive, warm, shared. One evening, I stood on my porch, watching the fireflies dance among the lilacs and lavender. Life wasn't about inheritance or old expectations anymore. It was about blooming late. Yes, but fully, because I had chosen who I wanted to be. A woman who loved gently, set boundaries kindly, and lived brightly. Roots deep in her past, branches reaching toward a new kind of future. Summer faded quietly, like the last breath of a long day. The lavender outside my porch had turned a softer shade of purple, swaying gently in the early fall breeze. I still sat by the same window each morning, nursing my tea, my fingers gently rubbing the lace cloth my mother once crocheted, thinking about the life I'd led and the one I was still building. I thought a lot about loneliness, not the kind that comes from missing someone, but the kind that settles in your bones, the kind that wraps around your shoulders like an old shawl and makes every day feel a little too quiet. I used to think that being independent was a sign of strength, but after nearly losing my life on an operating table, I realized we aren't meant to be alone for too long. No one is. One afternoon, I read an article that said, isolation in older adults increases the risk of cognitive decline and shortens life expectancy. I didn't need science to tell me that. I'd felt it in my soul. So I made a decision, one I'd never dared before. I opened up. It started small. I joined a gardening group at the local community center. They had this new initiative, pairing seniors with high school students, planting vegetables and stories together. It sounded strange at first, but I figured, why not? On our first day, a few teens showed up, looking unsure of what to expect: baggy t-shirts, curious eyes, and nervous laughter. I showed one of them how to plant tomatoes, telling him about the first time I tried to grow pumpkins with my husband back when we were newlyweds. A shy boy with curly hair looked at me and said, I didn't think I'd learn this much. From a garden and from you. My heart softened. After all these years, I still had something to give, and that gave me life. Soon after, I was asked to speak at a seniors group. I told them about my surgery, the 2 weeks in that lonely hospital room, the coldness of family silence. And then I said, love doesn't have an expiration date. Not in our youth, not in our old age. A simple call, a shared meal, and a soft hand on your back when you feel forgotten. Those are the medicines we need the most. The room was silent. Some wiped tears from their cheeks. One woman leaned in and whispered, thank you for saying what I've been feeling for years. I thought I was the only one. I didn't say a word, just held her hand. Sometimes, silence is the most powerful reply. A few weeks later, I was invited to join a special mentoring program. They paired seniors with young girls facing anxiety or family struggles. That's how I met Mia. We spoke every week on video calls. She was 14, loved poetry, and feared growing up. I, nearly 70, feared growing old alone. Somehow, we met in the middle. She read her poems aloud, voice trembling. I told her about the days I taught fourth graders and the nights I stayed up questioning if I'd done enough. One day, she said, you remind me of an old lantern. Small light, but it burns forever. I laughed, and for the first time in a long while, I felt seen not as someone left behind, but as someone lighting a path for someone else. Winter came, and I started keeping a journal again. Not to remember, but to release. I wrote about the nights I stared out the window, waiting for a knock that never came. I wrote about how my house had turned from a home into a cage. But I also wrote about the afternoons in the garden, laughing with teens and breathing fresh air that didn't smell like hospital soap. I wrote about the day I sat across from a stranger who listened to me with no expectations. And I wrote, it's never too late to replant your life. As long as you still believe the seeds inside, you can grow. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't want apologies. I just wanted to understand the story of my life, not through shame or anger, but through gratitude, grateful for those who left, so I could find myself, grateful for the quiet, so I could hear my own heart, grateful for the pain, because it reminded me what matters. I no longer needed to be remembered with guilt by my family. I wanted to be remembered as a woman who finally learned how to love herself fully and without apology. And if anyone asked, do you regret cutting ties with your son and your husband? I would smile and say, no, I regret not doing it sooner. The morning I turned 70, I woke to the sound of wind chimes, not the cheap kind, but the ones my sister and I had found at an old crafts fair in Vermont decades ago, handmade, heavy, resonant. I'd hung them by the back porch last spring, hoping they'd catch the wind when it mattered most. And that morning, they did. No calls, no cake, no birthday cards from the people who once claimed to be family. But I didn't mind. I brewed my coffee in silence. No television in the background. No passive-aggressive comments across the breakfast table. Just the sound of my old kettle whistling. birds making conversation outside the window, and the chimes singing like they had something to say. I sat in my favorite rocking chair, wrapped in the shawl my mother made when I was barely out of college. The house was still emptied of tension, nuance, and the kind of obligations that drain your soul. I'd never felt so full. That morning, I gave myself a birthday gift. Forgiveness. Not for them. For me, I forgave myself for staying silent when I should have spoken up, for shrinking when I should have stood tall, for confusing sacrifice with love, for giving all my best years to people who only saw me as useful, never as human. I'd carried those regrets like bricks. But turning 70, I decided, I am not a building made to carry weight. I am a garden. I am meant to grow. Later that day, I drove myself to the lake, Lake Ainsley, just north of town where my late sister and I used to fish and eat peanut butter sandwiches on the dock. The sky was painted in soft blues and pinks, the kind that make you wish someone were with you, until you realize, maybe you're enough. I walked the path to the bench she and I had carved our initials into, back when we were still girls with scraped knees and dreams, too big for our small town. I sat there for a long time, staring at the water. Then I took out my journal and wrote, "There is no such thing as wasted time if it teaches you who you truly are." Before leaving the lake, I took a photo, one of those wide, quiet shots with no people in it, just rippling water, leaning trees, and sky. I posted it on the Foundation's online group with a simple caption, "Today I turned 70, alone, but not lonely, grateful, not bitter, healing, not hiding." Within minutes, messages poured in from people across the country, other survivors of abandonment, others who'd been forgotten but had found a new beginning. A man in Ohio said, "You give me hope." A woman in Arizona wrote, "I needed to see this today. Thank you." It hit me then. This story of mine, it was never just mine. That evening, I received one message that made me pause. It was from Mia, the girl I'd mentored months ago. "Happy birthday, Helen. I'm going to college next year. I chose English, Lit, because of our talks. You helped me believe I had something to say. I love you." I read it twice. Then I cried, not because I was sad, but because, after everything, someone saw me as a reason to bloom, and that, I realized, was the kind of legacy I wanted. Not a will, not a family name passed down like an heirloom, but light, passed quietly, consistently, lovingly, like wind chimes, waiting for the right wind. As I turned out the lights that night, I stood at the porch and listened once more. The wind moved gently through the trees. The chimes answered back. I smiled to myself. It wasn't the life I thought I'd have, but in every way that mattered, it was finally mine. What did you feel while listening to this story all the way through? If it touched your heart, leave the number 1 inch the comments. If you didn't feel connected to it, feel free to write 0. Every piece of feedback means a lot to me, because it's thanks to you that I can keep going. It's from your responses that I draw the energy to tell the next chapter. A new story is coming, even deeper, even more moving, and I truly hope you'll be there to listen with me.